Venezuela. This is a country that is in an ongoing state of severe economic collapse. I have seen people blame this collapse on socialism, and I've seen people blame this collapse on U.S. sanctions. While the socialism that Venezuela does practice with its nationalized oil industry would certainly lead to a complete economic collapse of the country, relying on that as the sole explanation for what's going on is overly simplistic. Likewise, if you go through the timeline of actual sanctions that have been levied against Venezuela, they do not explain what is going on in the country. These sanctions become mildly important on August 24th of 2017, and they don't become very important until the 28th of January of 2019. To put that in perspective, that's just slightly more than 2 months prior to the time of me recording this video. But before I get started going through this in greater detail, I would ask that you please hit the like button and subscribe and even share the video. It will help the channel out. Let's get started with a bird's eye view of what has happened in the Venezuelan oil space since about 1976. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and created the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA as it's often called. From 1976 through about 1993, PDVSA's performance started declining, so Venezuela once again opened up its doors to foreign oil company investment in 1993. This allowed companies like Exxon and Conoco and Shell to move in. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected, as most of you probably know if you're watching a channel like this, and starting in the early 2000s, he started using PDVSA revenue, that is, Venezuelan oil revenues, to fund what he called the Bolivarian missions. These Bolivarian missions were fundamentally welfare programs, and they provided things like food and medical care and education and so on and so forth. There were 30 of these programs, and again, they were funded by Venezuelan oil revenues. Then starting in late 2002, moving into early 2003, PDVSA had some major strikes that caused a temporary blip in their oil production, and it ended with the firing of 19,000 PDVSA employees. From then, it was fairly smooth sailing until 2007, when Hugo Chavez nationalized the Venezuelan oil companies again. This time he expropriated U.S. oil company equipment from Exxon and Conoco, and there has been a long-running set of legal battles between Venezuela and these companies ever since then. To my knowledge, they haven't ended, although I haven't kept up with it. Then, in August of 2017, the Trump administration placed sanctions on Venezuela and PDVSA that are arguably the first sanctions that would actually have a real effect on the country, although this has been negated by China and Russia pumping in tens of billions of dollars into Venezuela. And that is a quick bird's eye view of what has happened in Venezuelan oil space since 1976. Next, I'm going to go through a timeline of the sanctions that the United States has placed on Venezuela. They're not what most people think that they are, and the really hard-hitting ones have been put into place fairly recently. I am going to get into a lot greater detail in this, so bear with me. In December of 2014, Congress passed legislation authorizing the President of the United States to sanction persons from Venezuela. For those of you unfamiliar with U.S. law, the term persons can mean an actual human being, but it can also refer to other entities like corporations. If you want to make the distinction that you're talking about an actual human being, you would use the term natural persons. The relevant portion of the legislation is as follows. In general, the sanctions described in this subsection are the following. A. Asset blocking. The exercise of all powers granted to the President by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to the extent necessary to block and prohibit all transactions in all property and interests in property of a person determined by the President to be subject to subsection A if such property and interests in property are in the United States, come within the United States, or it looks like Congress needs a copy editor, come within the possession or control of a United States person. Exclusion from the United States and revocation of visa or other documentation. In the case of an alien determined by the President to be subject to subsection A, denial of a visa to and exclusion from the United States of the alien and revocation in accordance with Section 221I of the Immigration and Nationality Act of any visa or other documentation of the alien. A quick summary of what this legislation means is that any assets of a person who are being sanctioned get frozen if they're in U.S. jurisdiction, and they're not allowed into the country. The first sanctions were not handed down under this new law until March of 2015 when Barack Hussein Obama signed Executive Order 13692. The relevant part of this executive order states as follows. All property and interests in property that are in the United States that hereafter come within the United States or that are or hereafter come within the possession or control of any United States person of the following persons are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in. The persons listed in the annex to this order and any person determined by the Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State A, to be responsible for or complicit in or responsible for ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing or to have participated in directly or indirectly any of the following or in relation to Venezuela, actions or policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions, significant acts of violence or conduct that constitute a serious abuse or violation of human rights, including against persons involved in anti-government protests in Venezuela in or since February 2014. Actions that prohibit, limit, or penalize the exercise of freedom of expression or peaceable assembly, or public corruption by senior officials within the government of Venezuela. As you can see, this executive order does paint with a fairly broad brush who can and cannot be sanctioned in Venezuela. It fundamentally boils down to the U.S. government saying that it can sanction anybody who is corrupt and anybody who it labels as a big meanie. Granted, there are plenty of not-so-nice people in Venezuela. Another thing that this executive order does, and I'm not going to read the names, is that it specifically sanctions 7 individual persons, and it makes it so that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury can sanction more people. And again, these sanctions fundamentally boil down to freezing assets that are in U.S. jurisdiction and are owned by these people. After this, not much happened with regards to sanctions against Venezuela for quite some time, although the legislation authorizing these sanctions was set to expire on December 31st, 2016. In July of 2016, Congress extended that authorization until 2019, December 31st. After that, not much happened with regards to sanctions in Venezuela until August 24th of 2017. And on that day, Trump signed Executive Order 13808. The important part of this executive order is as follows. All transactions related to provision of financing for and other dealings in the following by a United States person or within the United States are prohibited. New debt with a maturity of greater than 90 days of Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., new debt with a maturity of greater than 30 days or new equity of the government of Venezuela other than debt of PDVSA covered by subsection AI of this section, bonds issued by the government of Venezuela prior to the effective date of this order, or dividend payments or other distributions of profits to the government of Venezuela from any entity owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the government of Venezuela. Translation, the United States is cutting off funding from U.S. sources to fund the Venezuelan government and Venezuelan oil production. While I haven't found a smoking gun in terms of memos or conversations, this is likely because in May of 2017, Goldman Sachs, the vampire squid itself, purchased $2.8 billion in PDVSA 2022 bonds for 33 cents on the dollar. And while 33 cents on the dollar may sound like a spectacular deal, I tend to doubt that it is, knowing the state of Venezuela's finances. However, Goldman Sachs does excel at taking garbage financial instruments and profiting off of them at somebody else's expense. Regardless of whether or not this was the actual motivation for this executive order, as I've already stated in this video, China and Russia have been pumping in tens of billions of dollars into Venezuela. This ostensibly should have negated the effects of these particular sanctions. The next round of sanctions comes in March of 2018. This one is actually rather laughable. It's Executive Order 13827, and the relevant part reads as follows. All transactions related to, provision of financing for, and other dealings in, by a United States person or within the United States, any digital currency, digital coin, or digital token that was issued by, for, or on behalf of the government of Venezuela on or after January 9, 2018 are prohibited as of the effective date of this order. You see, Maduro tried to start this cryptocurrency called the Petro, if memory serves correctly, and it was going to get around any sanctions or anything like that, and it's an absolute joke. So Trump has prohibited you from purchasing something that you were probably never going to purchase anyways. Although I do admit that Goldman Sachs might have purchased it to screw other people over with and make a profit. The next round of sanctions are another attempt to cut off the spigot, at least from the United States. And this is Executive Order 13835, and it was signed in May of 2018. The relevant part reads as follows. All transactions related to, provision of financing for, and other dealings in the following by a United States person or within the United States are prohibited. The purchase of any debt owed to the government of Venezuela, including accounts receivable, any debt owed to the government of Venezuela that is pledged as collateral after the effective date of this order, including accounts receivable, and the sale, transfer, assignment, or pledging as collateral by the government of Venezuela of any equity interest in any entity in which the government of Venezuela has a 50% or higher ownership interest. I read that as the United States is not going to let people from within the United States pay off debt that it owes to Venezuela, and it's not going to let Venezuela pledge any collateral that it has a stake in ownership greater than 50% for whatever financial transactions it has conducted or will conduct in the United States, which is likely to be nothing. But again, that doesn't stop China or Russia from doing business with Venezuela. The next sanction came on November 1st of 2018, and it does a little bit more than I'm going to read off for you, but this is the important part. All property and interests in property that are in the United States that hereafter come within the United States or that are hereafter come within the possession or control of any United States person of the following persons are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in. Any person determined by the Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State to operate in the gold sector of the Venezuelan economy or in any other sector of the Venezuelan economy that may be determined by the Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State. Gold has an extremely long history as a monetary metal, and it's what countries tend to fall back on if bad things really start to happen, so the Trump administration is going after Venezuela's ability to deal in gold. But again, this only affects transactions with people in the United States and U.S. citizens. The final sanction came on January 28th, 2019, so just under 2 months ago, and this is the one where sanctions actually start to get serious with Venezuela. This was Executive Order 13857, and you can see the top paragraph. It has a bunch of sections of other executive orders, and these sections are where definitions were. And it changes the definitions, and it says the term government of Venezuela includes the state and government of Venezuela, any political subdivision, agency, or instrumentality thereof, including the Central Bank of Venezuela and Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA. Any person owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the foregoing, and any person who has acted or purported to act directly or indirectly or on behalf of any of the foregoing, including as a member of the Maduro regime. When I say this is the big one, it's because it allows the United States government to freeze all assets in U.S. jurisdiction of the Venezuelan Central Bank and of PDVSA. While I don't know what financial assets the Venezuelan Central Bank actually has in U.S. jurisdictions, I assume that it does have some and that this is actually a big deal. I do know that PDVSA's U.S.-based subsidiary is Citgo, and in fact, sanctions have been applied. This means that Citgo can continue to do business in the United States. However, when it deposits money, it has to deposit it into a frozen account to later be released back to the Venezuelan government after Maduro has been toppled. The other option is to not do business in the United States And in fact, in January of 2019, the U.S. imported approximately 19 million barrels of oil from Venezuela, and in February, it imported approximately 8 million barrels. That's less than half of the January numbers. It's difficult at this point to say for sure whether this sanction is the ultimate cause, because at the same time, Venezuela's oil production is also plummeting very rapidly. But I suspect that it probably is, and when the March numbers for oil imports from Venezuela come out, I suspect that it's going to be at or near zero. But those numbers won't come out for around another month. This leads to the question, can other countries take up the slack from what the United States was consuming? Although looking at how fast Venezuela's oil production is plummeting, the answer to that may be moot. Now that you've seen the legal framework for all of the sanctions that have been levied against Venezuela, I have gone through the State Department's webpage and all of the press releases, and I have scraped up all of the different natural persons who have been sanctioned, as well as all of the different companies, as well as the countries from which those companies came from. And yes, as you can see, it is a rather extensive list of press releases, and that does mean that it is possible that I missed a person here or missed a company there, but I guarantee that if the number is not 100% accurate, it is still very close to the real number. As you can see, Obama sanctioned 7 people, and no other people were sanctioned from Venezuela until several months after Trump took office. This would have been in April of 2017. A grand total of 89 people were sanctioned from Venezuela. Sanctioning 89 people in a country of 31.5 million is not going to do very much to bring the economy to a grinding halt like Venezuela's economy has done. This next graph is the number of companies that have had their assets frozen because of Venezuelan sanctions. And you'll notice that on January 8th, 2019, there is a huge jump. But there is a kicker here. That huge jump isn't what most people would think it is. Yes, 23 companies had their assets that were in the jurisdiction of the United States frozen. 20 out of the 23 were based in the United States and owned by Venezuelans. There is a good chance that many of these companies should have been looked at by U.S. law enforcement anyway, because there is a good possibility that they're shell companies that are used for money laundering. Besides those U.S. companies, there are only 2 or possibly 3 companies that had their assets frozen in the United States that it actually really probably will hurt Venezuela. The 2 are the Central Bank of Venezuela and PDVSA, the Venezuelan state-owned oil company. But PDVSA was sanctioned on January 28th of 2019, and the Central Bank of Venezuela was sanctioned on April 17th of 2019, so very recently. This means that the sanctioning of those companies did not cause any of the previous problems. The third company that may be important for the sanctions, I simply don't know about what kinds of holdings it has in places where the United States has jurisdiction, is Bandes, the Venezuelan Development Bank. Its subsidiaries were sanctioned as well, so you might be able to count that as 6 separate companies, in which case the total number of companies sanctioned would be 42 instead of 37. Either way, so long as you know that it seems to be like some sort of bank holding company, like Citi has a bunch of subsidiaries, that was all sanctioned, but that was on March 22nd of 2019, so recent enough to have not had a major effect yet, even if it is going to have a huge effect. Next is the number of companies that had their assets frozen by country of origin. So you can see the United States by far has the most at around 20, and that's from that one January 8th, 2019 event. After that, you'll notice that Venezuela has the second largest amount at 7. Liberia had 4 companies sanctioned, and this was because they were shipping oil from Venezuela to Cuba. 2 of the companies are of unknown origins, at least to me, and I would hope that the State Department and the Treasury actually knew, but I don't know. It's possible that they're from the United States, it's possible that they're from Spain, and it's possible that they're based in Venezuela. Russia had one of its banks sanctioned because it was allegedly helping Venezuela to bypass the sanctions, and Greece and Italy each had 1 company sanctioned for the same reason that Liberia did, and that is shipping oil from Venezuela to Cuba. Now that you have an idea as to around how many people have been sanctioned, how many companies, which ones are important, as well as the legal framework for the sanctioning, Let's move on to oil production and oil revenues, because this is where the rubber really starts to meet the road when it comes to why Venezuela is starting to collapse. I would like to emphasize that this data is only an estimate. It is not exact. If you go sniffing around for the amount of oil that Venezuela has been exporting or the amount that it has been producing, you will find different numbers depending on the source. Also, another issue is that the export and production figures that I have are on an annual basis. They're not on a weekly or monthly, which would honestly be better, but because they're on an annual basis, you should take any peaks or valleys to be on a plus or minus 6 months basis. That being said, Bloomberg is the most generous source that I've seen for production and export numbers for the Venezuelan oil industry, and Bloomberg is what I used. You should also notice that the production values that it shows are fairly close to equal to the export values that it shows for 2018. This doesn't count imports, which is one issue, but the fact that they're so close is alarming for the Venezuelan economy. Before I move on, I would like to show you two other estimates from other people. I don't know how these estimates were arrived, and I don't know what their data source is, so keep that in mind. This first one in green bars shows that the creator obviously thought that the peak of Venezuelan oil revenues was in 2011. Knowing what global oil prices did throughout history, I disagree, but it still shows that there is a drop from 2013 to 2014. Again, I disagree. I think that drop probably happened in 2014 to 2015, but we're talking a plus or minus 6 month time frame here, so perhaps on that particular front, the creator of this chart is correct. It appears that whoever created this next chart had access to monthly or even weekly data, which is what I would like, but I just don't know where to find it at the moment. This is in much closer agreement to my chart in terms of timing, although much more fine-grained. This is also in very close agreement with what global oil prices did, which leads me to believe that in terms of timing of peaks and valleys, it is accurate. Where it does differ from my chart is in terms of the percentage change that is indicated. I think the percentage changes are smaller, and that while Venezuela's oil production and oil revenues have plummeted, I don't think that they've plummeted to quite this degree, but that's my personal opinion. I personally think that from their 2007-2008 peak, their revenue is down by 2/3, not 5/6. Now, tell me that means that Venezuela is not screwed. Either way, let's move on with what this means for Venezuela. Oil is the keystone commodity for the global economy, and in fact for most national economies as well. People don't understand that if we stopped all global oil production overnight without a drop-in replacement, the end result would be billions dead. This is why even without accounting for imports, when I see that production and exports are getting pretty close to each other, in Venezuela, it sends up red flags that say this economy is about to do very bad things to people. This is also why I am reluctant to make the conclusion that the United States imports of oil from Venezuela dropped in February of 2019 strictly because of the sanctions. I do believe that that is at the very least a strong contributing factor, but there is reason to believe that there could be other causes. Every indicator shows that Venezuela's economy is in a tailspin and would be even without U.S. sanctions. With dropping oil production in mind, let me read this little snippet from a Business Insider article. This critical economic, political, and social situation does not seem to have an easy solution. In Venezuela, 96% of foreign currency earnings come from oil industry, and with the collapse of oil prices, income has fallen more than 50%. But in addition to a decline in revenues, oil production has also dropped, adding insult to injury. 96%. I could not think of a more clear-cut statement that Venezuela's economy depends almost solely on its oil industry. Nobody is going to use Venezuelan bolivars for international trade. Venezuela is going to need foreign currency to conduct international trade, and while that could mean Japanese yen or Chinese yuan, it most likely means US dollars. That is the world reserve currency currently. This drop in foreign reserve currencies means that Venezuela is going to have a very difficult time importing things like food and toilet paper. And again, even without US sanctions, the drop in oil prices would have guaranteed that Venezuela's economy was sent into a tailspin because of its overdependence on one single industry. This means it's going to have a very difficult time providing resources for its 30 Bolivarian missions that Hugo Chavez instituted in the early 2000s. Yet people in Venezuela have likely become dependent on the welfare state that he created in the name of socialism. And make no mistake, when Chavez nationalized the oil industry, he was seizing the means of production, which is socialism. Instead of taking the excess oil revenues and spending it on expanding its oil production or even just maintaining it, Chavez and Maduro have spent it on maintaining welfare programs, on buying votes. Instead of taking that excess oil revenue and using it to expand other portions of the Venezuelan economy, such as agriculture or manufacturing of non-oil goods, Chavez and Maduro spent it on welfare to buy votes. The existence of the Bolivarian missions demonstrates this. It was understood before sanctions were even authorized that this lack of investment in oil infrastructure, this socialism, was going to lead to a decline in oil production in Venezuela. In late November, Citigroup published a report concluding that Venezuela presents probably the biggest bulk risk to the oil market in 2014 outside of the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region. Venezuela is struggling to pay its debts, and the government is pillaging PDVSA's coffers as it searches for cash. Without money to invest in its oil fields, even if Venezuela can avoid a more acute crisis such as debt default or a coup, its oil output will decline over the long term. This was written in December of 2013, and remember, it wasn't until 2014 that the sanctions were even authorized, and it wasn't until 2015 that any sanctions were even implemented, and then it was only sanctions against 7 individual persons, at least until Trump took office. There were even earlier indicators that Venezuela's economy was destined to go into a tailspin. This was from Hugo Chavez. "I want the National Guard on the streets with the people to fight against speculation," said Mr. Chavez during his weekly television show A lo Presidente. "Go ahead and speculate if you want, but we will take your business away and we will give it to the workers, to the people," he said, stating that there was no reason for businesses to be raising prices. This statement was made in 2010, and yes, Chavez did go on to seize businesses for raising prices. You see, the context behind this was that the bolivar had been pegged to the US dollar at 2.15 bolivars per US dollar. Chavez changed that to 2.6 bolivars per US dollar. That is, he devalued the Venezuelan currency because even back in 2010, Venezuela had a wee bit of an inflation problem. This devaluation raised the costs of Venezuelan businesses to get goods to sell to the public, so they had to raise prices. In all of Chavez's wisdom, he didn't want to allow this, so he fundamentally set price controls, which in an inflationary environment leads to shortages. Again, let me point out that 2010 was long before any sanctions had been applied to Venezuela by the United States. If we move forward to February of 2013, this was in the news about Venezuela. The black market price for dollars in the country has risen to a record high at more than 22 bolivars. That compares to the new official exchange rate of 6.3 bolivars per dollar, with the old 4.3 rate eliminated last Friday. Economists said that at 6.3 bolivars to the dollar, Venezuela's currency remains overvalued, with the equilibrium price believed to be about 9 bolivars. So it's 22 bolivars on the black market in 2013 before any sanctions had been levied against Venezuela, and the official exchange rate is 6.3 when back in 2010 they had raised it up to 2.6. It's clear at this point that there is a major problem with Venezuela's currency. It was clear in 2013 that Venezuela was going to destroy its currency. If you look at this chart, you see an unofficial exchange rate of bolivars to US dollars in the Colombian town of Cucuta. You can see that before the Trump administration took power and really got serious with the sanctions, that inflation was out of control already in Venezuela. Venezuela did this to itself. It did it through socialism. It did it through what's known as Dutch disease, that is, having your economy rely only on one industry to the detriment of others, and it did it through printing too many bolivars. Even with all of this self-inflicted inflation and instability, Venezuela has not been alone on the world stage. This was from 2018. Even as other countries have backed off from doing business with Venezuela, China has doubled down on its support. Over the past decade, Venezuela received over $62 billion from China, which is 53% of all money lent by China to Latin America. China currently owns $23 billion worth of Venezuela's foreign debt, making it the country's biggest creditor. As I've said throughout this video, China and Russia have been pumping tens of billions of dollars into Venezuela. And again, this article was from 2018, link is down below. And foreign cooperation for Venezuela doesn't end there. In 2015, Venezuela reached an agreement with Russia. President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, says his country has reached an agreement with Russia, which will see an investment of $14 billion in the oil and gas sector over the next few years. The agreement was reached between the Venezuelan state oil firm PDVSA and the Russian oil giant Rosneft after talks in the South American country's capital, Caracas, between Maduro, the president of PDVSA, Julio Del Pino, and the president of Rosneft, Igor Sechin. The article further goes on to talk about Venezuela's goals. PDVSA had set an ambitious target to try and double the country's oil production to 6 million barrels a day by 2019, which is 8 million tons a year. The figure in 2014 was just 1.6 million tons per year. 4 million of those barrels are expected to come from the Orinoco Belt. However, Maduro did not provide any details of how the investment plan would be put into place. Even with Chinese funding, Russian funding, and help from the Russian oil giant Rosneft, Venezuela's oil output is still falling. That is how poorly run this country is. If Russia and China are not currently in the process of deciding to pull out of Venezuela because it's a basket case, they will be soon because they're going to have to cut their losses. Once China and Russia make this calculation, Venezuela will become even more vulnerable to the machinations and manipulations of the United States government. Given the rumblings coming out of the likes of John Bolton and Pompeo regarding Venezuela, I think it's safe to say that the U.S. government is channeling its inner Rahm Emanuel. For those of you unfamiliar with Rahm Emanuel, he's the former mayor of Chicago, and he has a very famous quote: "You never let a serious crisis go to waste." And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. In my opinion, the United States government is looking at Venezuela, seeing that it's an economic basket case, and it's seeing an opportunity. If the U.S. government just wanted Maduro gone, all that it would have to do is wait. The socialism combined with Venezuela's oil-dependent economy would take care of him without U.S. intervention. On the other hand, if the U.S. government wants a puppet government in Venezuela, it would be well served to accelerate the process and then install a puppet using the CIA. So even more chaos, and then take advantage of that chaos to get what it wants. The U.S. government has done this in the past. In the 1950s, the United Kingdom implemented a series of naval blockades and embargoes against Iran, which sent Iran's economy into a tailspin, and then it got the CIA involved, and there was a CIA-induced coup in Iran in 1953. This got rid of Mossadegh and put, I believe it was Zahedi, into the prime minister position and elevated the position of the Shah. The Shah then remained in power until the end of the 1970s. We've been doing this for a while. This latest round of sanctions against Venezuela does look as though it probably will increase the pain in Venezuela. It does look as though it will hasten Venezuela's inevitable economic collapse. Venezuela is floating dead in the water, bleeding to death from self-inflicted wounds, and now the sharks are circling looking for an easy meal. I will say that there is one caveat, and that is that I see no evidence that the CIA or other alphabet soup agencies are taking into account the differences in culture between Venezuela and the Anglosphere. And if they're not, that's going to come back and bite them, and their plans will only work short term. They won't even work medium term. But even understanding that Venezuela's economic wounds are self-inflicted, and even understanding that Nicolas Maduro is not a nice guy, he's not somebody I would like to live underneath, I'm still against unnecessary foreign entanglements, and I do view a regime change in Venezuela as an unnecessary foreign entanglement. So here's to hoping that Congress does not renew the authorization for sanctions against Venezuela this year. Although I do think that the idiots in Congress are going to, because this is the ride that never ends.